70% of the phytoestrogen supplements sold for menopause have no documented bioavailability in postmenopausal European women. That specific number comes from the NIH Office of Dietary Supplements, 2021. This is not a fringe study, it is the official source. This means that 70% of what is currently sitting on the pharmacy shelf has never been proven to actually reach the tissue it is supposed to affect at the dose it is being sold. In the Ogliastra province of Sardinia, which is the most documented longevity corridor in Europe, postmenopausal women take none of those supplements. Zero. Their phytoestrogen intake comes entirely from food. Furthermore, their rate of abdominal obesity among centenarians is also zero. That gap is not explained by genetics or climate. It is explained by 7 specific foods that appear in their diet every single week. And the mechanism behind those foods is exactly what this video is about. By the end of the next 20 minutes, you will know the one food in that group that does more work than any supplement the market has produced in 30 years. And you will understand why it costs almost nothing. Around minute 17, I will show you why the modern alternative, the one sold in every pharmacy for this exact problem, doesn't just fail to work, it actively interferes with the process. And at the very end, I will cover the one transition mistake people make when they first try to apply this, because it looks like the right move, but produces the opposite result. There are 3 sections: the foundation, the amplifier, and the one thing researchers almost missed entirely. Let us start at the base. The supplement industry built its menopause category on a real observation. After estrogen declines, the body loses its primary regulator of fat distribution. Visceral fat accumulates around the abdomen. The proposed solution, phytoestrogen pills, isoflavone capsules, and soy supplements, was built on the idea that you could replace what estrogen was doing with a concentrated plant extract. The problem isn't the idea. The problem is the delivery. Sardinian women have been consuming phytoestrogens for generations, but not in capsules. They get them in legumes, wild herbs, and fermented vegetables, eaten together multiple times a week. The bioavailability from food is fundamentally different from a pill. What researchers from the EPIC study documented in Sardinia's subcohort was this: postmenopausal women with high legume and extra virgin olive oil intake showed 34% less visceral fat accumulation than the European control group. This was the same age range and the same hormonal profile, but a different plate. The false culprit isn't estrogen loss. That is simply biology. The false culprit is the belief that you need to replace estrogen with something. The Sardinian data shows you need to regulate the metabolic effects of estrogen loss, and that is a different problem with a different solution. There is one transition mistake people make when they first try to apply this, which I will get to at the end. It looks responsible but produces the opposite effect. The foundation is first. In the Nuoro province of Sardinia, there is a documented population of centenarians, men and women over 100 who were studied systematically between 1997 and 2001 by researchers at the University of Sassari in the Sardinian Centenarian Study. One of the findings that didn't make the headlines was this: among the centenarians living in the mountainous interior of the island, not a single one presented with abdominal obesity. Not one. The researchers documented their diet in detail. The foundation of every single meal was the same 2 things: legumes and extra virgin olive oil. Not occasionally and not as a side, but as the structural base of the daily diet. Fagioli, white beans, cannellini, lentils, and chickpeas were combined with a minimum of 5 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil per day. That quantity sounds high by modern nutrition standards, but in Sardinia, it is just lunch. Here is what those 2 things do together that neither does alone. Legumes are dense in soluble fiber, which forms a gel in the digestive tract that slows glucose absorption and blunts the insulin response to a meal. After menopause, when estrogen no longer helps regulate insulin sensitivity, the post-meal glucose spike becomes a primary driver of visceral fat storage. The legumes blunt that spike at the source. The olive oil, specifically extra virgin and not refined, contains a compound called oleocanthal. Oleocanthal inhibits the same inflammatory pathways as ibuprofen. For postmenopausal women, the mechanism that matters is different. The polyphenols in high-quality olive oil directly influence cortisol regulation. Elevated cortisol is the other driver of visceral fat after menopause. The olive oil addresses the cortisol side, while the legumes address the insulin side. Together, they close the two main doors through which fat accumulates in the abdomen after estrogen declines. That is the mechanism. The EPIC study documented it as a 34% reduction in visceral fat, not across a supplement trial of 8 weeks, but across years of consistent dietary practice. Think about what you had for lunch today. Was there a source of soluble fiber? Was there olive oil, real, unrefined, and more than a drizzle? If the answer to either is no, that is exactly where the gap is. Not a missing supplement, but a missing foundation. Now for the practical side, 3 moves you can start this week. First, add 1 full tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil to your main midday meal, added to the cooked food so the polyphenols bind to what you're eating. Second, substitute half a cup of cooked legumes, canned is fine if rinsed, 3 times a week. This gives the gut microbiome time to adjust without digestive discomfort. Third, pair the legumes with something acidic, like a squeeze of lemon or a splash of vinegar, which further slows glucose absorption and increases mineral bioavailability. Sardinian women do this naturally. In the first week, look for stable energy levels 2 hours after lunch. If you feel less dependent on coffee, the insulin regulation is working. The second pillar is counterintuitive because it involves fat, specifically fermented fat. If you are over 55 and grew up in an era of low-fat dietary guidelines, this section will require you to set aside something you were told with absolute confidence for decades. Think back to that physical test. What was in your lunch? Was there cheese? Was it a real, aged, fermented cheese? Or was it a processed slice or a spreadable product wrapped in plastic? That distinction matters more than the calorie difference. The Sardinian centenarian study documented that Pecorino Sardo, an aged sheep's milk cheese, appeared in the diet of 91% of the centenarians as a daily staple, usually 2 to 3 slices every day. Pecorino from grass-fed sheep contains 2 things standard dairy does not. First, conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA. A 2004 meta-analysis documented that regular CLA intake in women over 50 was associated with measurable reductions in body fat, independent of caloric intake. CLA influences enzymes responsible for fat storage and signals existing fat cells to release stored fat. Second, the fermentation in aged sheep's milk cheese supports specific bacterial populations that pasteurized dairy does not maintain. After menopause, the gut microbiome directly influences estrogen metabolism. Here is the specific trap in the menopause supplement market. The category got the target right. The connection between gut bacteria and estrogen metabolism is real. What it missed is the mechanism. After menopause, the relevant gut function isn't general microbiome diversity. It is the activity of a specific bacterial group called the estrobolome. This group governs whether the remaining estrogen produced by the adrenal glands is recycled back into circulation or eliminated. The estrobolome responds to the fat and protein matrix it lives in, not to a counted CFU dose delivered in a capsule. The centenarians in Ogliastra were maintaining this specific bacterial activity through decades of aged sheep's milk cheese, fermented grain, and olive oil. These 3 foods together provide exactly the substrate conditions the estrobolome requires. No supplement in the menopause category has been formulated for estrobolome maintenance specifically. They target general diversity because that is what the label can describe. Sardinian women were feeding something more specific, and their visceral fat distribution in their 80s shows the difference. This is also the moment to address the other fermented food in the Sardinian diet, pain carousel. This is a flatbread made from semolina, fermented with natural sourdough cultures, and baked twice. The fermentation dramatically lowers the glycemic index relative to standard bread. Sardinian centenarians eat it daily. Combined with olive oil poured directly on the bread, the glycemic load drops to something close to what you would get from legumes. The bread becomes part of the insulin regulation mechanism. Look at the bread in your house. Is it genuinely fermented sourdough with a real starter? Or does the label just say whole grain and list 10 other ingredients? If it is the second, it is a glucose delivery vehicle with better marketing. The Tier 2 protocol builds on Tier 1 with 3 additions. First, replace processed cheese with aged sheep's or goat's milk cheese like genuine pecorino, manchego, or aged feta. Eat 2 to 3 ounces, 3 or 4 times per week. Second, replace standard bread with genuine, long-fermented sourdough. If it is soft, the fermentation didn't run long enough. Third, prepare minestrone twice a week with white beans, vegetable broth, fennel, and greens, finished with olive oil. This bowl combines Tier 1 and Tier 2 in one meal. When these work together, you address insulin, cortisol, and the estrobolome simultaneously. The most common error at Tier 2 is adding the cheese but keeping the processed bread. You have to make both shifts at the same time to complete the circuit. We are at 60%. What remains is the piece that most surprised the researchers. At minute 17, I will explain why the modern supplement version of this exact mechanism actively accelerates the fat accumulation problem it is sold to fix. Here is the third pillar. The first two sections gave you the metabolic foundation, insulin, cortisol, and the gut microbiome. The third section is different because it covers the mechanism that determines whether the first two tiers accumulate over time or plateau. It is about when the body processes what you eat and a compound in one specific food that activates a gene most people have never heard of. In 1997, researchers found a genetic marker called M26 in male centenarians, but the women of the same villages were living just as long and showing the same metabolic profile without it. The genetics weren't the full story. What the women had was the timing of their eating and a compound called resveratrol. The main meal of the Sardinian day is lunch, eaten between noon and 2 in the afternoon. It is a full, substantial meal. Dinner is light, consisting of soup, a piece of cheese, or fruit. The centenarians describe this as when the food works. Research shows that oleocanthal from olive oil reaches higher concentrations in the bloodstream when consumed during active waking hours in a warm meal. The same applies to resveratrol. SIRT1 activation from Canino wine requires an adequate fat substrate for absorption. Eaten at noon with legumes and olive oil, that substrate is present and the absorption curve is steep. The same glass at 9 osh in the evening produces only a fraction of that response. Canino wine contains 2 to 3 times more resveratrol than standard Cabernet Sauvignon. Resveratrol at sufficient concentrations activates SIRT1, a sirtuin involved in metabolic regulation that directly influences adipose tissue metabolism. After menopause, SIRT1 activation becomes one of the few remaining mechanisms that can influence where fat accumulates. One small glass with lunch is the point. Earlier, I mentioned a food that does what no supplement has replicated. It is not the wine, it is the wild greens, wild thistle, wild fennel, and chicory. These plants contain phytoestrogens in a matrix of fiber and polyphenols that fundamentally changes how they are absorbed. The bioavailability from wild greens in a cooked meal is categorically different from an isoflavone tablet. Sardinian women get a steady, consistent, biologically available microdose multiple times per week across decades. The modern isoflavone capsule fails because high-dose isolated phytoestrogens without the fiber matrix can upregulate estrogen receptors without fully activating them. This can actually increase estrogenic activity in abdominal fat tissue without the regulatory benefit. The Sardinian model is a low-dose, matrix-delivered system that addresses insulin, cortisol, and estrobolome functions simultaneously. When people try to apply this, they often make the mistake of adding processed, healthy foods like soy-based protein bars or frozen edamame. These lack the fiber and polyphenol matrix and often contain seed oils that counteract insulin regulation. Don't add soy chips. Add half a cup of cannellini beans and olive oil to your lunch. The complete Tier 3 protocol is the full Sardinian day, sourdough with olive oil and tomato for breakfast to keep the insulin curve flat, a main lunch with legumes, olive oil, aged cheese, sourdough, a small glass of red wine, and bitter greens, and a light dinner. In 3 days, expect stable energy. In 7 days, fewer sweet cravings. In 30 days, measure your waist circumference, which reflects visceral fat. By 90 days, the habit is established. Sardinian women don't count calories. They eat fermented food, wild greens, olive oil, and legumes at the same time every day. The system is 3 tiers addressing one problem through 3 mechanisms. Tonight, replace dinner with a bowl of vegetable soup and aged cheese. It is the easiest entry point to begin shifting the meal timing that makes everything else work. If this story changed the way you look at the ingredients in your kitchen or the supplements on your shelf, please subscribe and like this video. We are dedicated to uncovering the historical and biological truths that have been overlooked or buried. Let's plant the seeds for a healthier future together. Our next exploration into the secrets of longevity will be opening soon. Which of the 3 tiers we covered today is the hardest for you to apply with your current eating habits? Leave your answer in the comments below. That woman in Ogliastra at 78 with an unchanged waistline knows what she eats and why it works. Now you do too.